Working through the remainder of Daniel chapter 11, verses 1 through 35. If you're in Wiersbe's book, it's his chapter 11 of the study guide. If you remember, we finished up last time with, in the visions which we've seen in different forms since King Nebuchadnezzar, the succession of regimes, of empires, and we've just worked through the Greek Empire and its aftermath being broken into 4 kingdoms, and then the vision in this chapter being given to Daniel focuses on 2 of those 4 kingdoms. What the vision refers to as the kingdom of the north, which is the kingdom of Syria, overseen by the family of the Seleucids, and the kingdom of the south, which is Egypt, overseen by the Ptolemies. Consider what Wiersbe says as we move into this next part of this study. Just as a sense of perspective that I want you to kind of bring with you as we move through tonight and finish our study of Daniel and looking at his last vision next week. Wiersbe writes, as you review the history of the relationship between Egypt and Syria, the kingdoms of the south and the north, and specifically the family relationships among the Seleucids, which was the ruling family of the north, of Syria, you can't help but realize that human nature hasn't changed over these thousands of years. The ancient world had its share of intrigue, political deception, violence, greed, and war. The lust for power and wealth drove men and women to violate human rights and break divine laws, to go to any length to get what they wanted. They slaughtered thousands of innocent people, plundered the helpless, and even killed their own relatives just to wear a crown or sit on a throne. I don't think we have to look too hard to see these same human traits in our world today, which drives home the relevance of looking at Daniel and his visions and what God had to say to him and through him down through the ages to us. If you remember last week, we looked at Daniel's vision by looking at the prophecies and overlaying them with history. We're going to do that again tonight, but tonight we focus on one man in history instead of the many people we looked at last week. And what we're going to focus on tonight are the prophecies specifically about a man, Antiochus IV Epiphanes, who became king of the northern kingdom, Syria. A little background, which not only gives us a little historical background, but starts to show us a little of the character of Mr. Antiochus. He succeeded his brother as king, Seleucus IV, who dies, as Wiersbe says, suddenly, presumably poisoned. And as we learn more about Mr. Antiochus, you may join me in my suspicion that we may have a primary suspect in the family. But it never goes there conclusively, so that's just speculation, but it is speculation. We see that where we left off last time with verse 20. Let's see. Where it talks about the preceding king before Antiochus. In a few years, he will be destroyed, yet not in anger or in battle. Again, it's suspected that he was poisoned. So listen as we now move from Seleucus IV into Antiochus IV. Listen to verses 21 through 24. It reads, "He will be succeeded by a contemptible person who has not been given the honor of royalty. He will invade the kingdom when its people feel secure, and he will seize it through intrigue. Then an overwhelming army will be swept away before him. Both it and a prince of the covenant will be destroyed. After coming to an agreement with him, he will act deceitfully, and with only a few people, he will rise to power. When the richest provinces feel secure, he will invade them and will achieve what neither his fathers nor his forefathers did. He will distribute plunder, loot, and wealth among his followers. He will plot the overthrow of fortresses, but only for a time. So in those few verses, we get an overview of the reign of Antiochus IV Epiphanes. Now, his name was Antiochus IV. He gave himself the name Epiphanes, which means glorious one. Again, a little insight into his character. Very humble, yes. We can admire him for his humility. Verse 21 says he was not given the honor of royalty. And Wiersbe explains the history there. The successor to Seleucus IV was not Antiochus. It was a young man, and I don't have it, but I'm presuming it was Seleucus' son, Demetrius Soter, who was so young he needed a legal guardian when he officially took the throne. And Antiochus IV stood up and said, I will mentor the young man. Right? And instead he stole the throne out from under him. So this is how Antiochus IV Epiphanes becomes king of the northern kingdom. It's through intrigue and deception. And as we see in those verses that I just read, his style of leadership, if you will, is treachery. He leads and he advances by deception coupled with brute force. Verse 22 talks about an overwhelming army. And Wiersbe explains that this is not a particular army at a particular time. This is a general reference to all the forces that will oppose Antiochus during his reign. He becomes so powerful, he sweeps them all aside. Nobody, for a while, can stand up to Antiochus IV Epiphanes and the kingdom of Syria. All who oppose him are crushed. Consider a couple of the notes I have in my Bible to verses 22 and then 32. As I already explained about the overwhelming army being a symbolic reference to all opposition against Antiochus, the prince of the covenant that is mentioned in that verse may very well be the high priest of the time. The covenant is a reference to the Jewish people and the Jewish nation. And at the time, there was a high priest, Onias III, who was assassinated by Menelaus in the year 170, and we're going to get to that as we move through the verses, who then took the high priest position from him. So again, we see not only the drama and the intrigue playing out in the north, but in the Holy Land itself, as they get swept up into this political drama of the kingdom of the north and the kingdom of the south. And as the note of the later verses talks about, this Menelaus who assassinated the legitimate high priest was won over by Antiochus and conspired with him against the Jews who were loyal to God. We'll get more into that as we go through tonight. So Antiochus has the throne of the kingdom of the north, Syria. And we see then, as we move into verse 25, his first campaign against Egypt, the kingdom of the south. So listen to verses 25 through 28. With a large army, he will stir up his strength and courage against the king of the south. The king of the south will wage war with a large and very powerful army, but he will not be able to stand because of the plots devised against him. Those who eat from the king's provisions will try to destroy him. His army will be swept away, and many will fall in battle. The two kings, with their hearts bent on evil, will sit at the same table and lie to each other. but to no avail, because an end will still come at the appointed time. The king of the north will return to his own country with great wealth, but his heart will be set against the holy covenant. He will take action against it and then return to his own country. So you've got Syria in the north, you've got Egypt in the south. In between, you have the land of Israel. Again, just a refresher on the context and the perspective of where we are. Between the Persian Empire and this Greek Empire, the Jews had been allowed to return. They had been banished by Babylon, taken from their land, their city was destroyed, their temple was destroyed. How long were they in Babylon? 70 years. And at the end of that, Cyrus, the king at that time, decreed that the Jews were to be allowed to go back and rebuild. This fulfilled the prophecies that had been laid out by Jeremiah. And we have it recorded in the chapters we've already looked at of Daniel. So they've gone back. They've rebuilt. They've reestablished themselves in Palestine and that region there of what had been the nation of Israel, and now they had returned as a people, maybe not fully autonomous because of all the empire shifting that was going on at the time, but they were identified back in their own homeland and at least semi-autonomous. That's where they are when the Greek Empire comes in, when the Greek Empire breaks apart, and that's where it brings us up to where we are now, where they lie between the kingdom of the north and the kingdom of the south, and they are constantly in the middle of the drama that's going on, and the intrigue and the power plays and everything else. And as we see in these verses, Antiochus was bad, but Antiochus was not alone. Business as usual, these two kings are sitting down to the table after the battle, and Wiersbe says that Antiochus won, but he didn't win it all. He had a limited victory. They sit down to negotiate, and neither one has any intention of speaking straight with the other one. They're just both lying through their teeth to get what they can out of this. So Antiochus sits in this conference, gets whatever agreement is made with the king of the south, isn't satisfied, and on his way back home, which takes him through the land of Israel, he sets his eyes on Jerusalem and decides he doesn't like them. And he's going to vent his frustrations on the people and the land of Israel, which in this part of the in this part of the vision and the translation we have is referred to as the Holy Covenant, or the people of the covenant. And we see another affirmation in verse 27, where it talks about the appointed time, an affirmation to the sovereignty of what king in all of this drama? Yeah, the king, God. All right? So you've got human kings playing their games, acting out, deceiving, treacherous, brutal, but only for the time that's given to them, because God is the king at all times. Consider another of the notes to verse 27. These two treacherous kings were probably Antiochus IV of Syria and Ptolemy VI of Egypt. Treachery and deceit are the power broker's way to position himself over someone else. When two power brokers try to gain the upper hand, it is a mutually weakening and self-destructive process. And it is also futile because God ultimately holds all power in his hands. And that's what we see is that section of the verses closes out. They will lie to each other, but to no avail, because an end will still come at the appointed time. And we can read into that, not only is the time appointed, but the end is appointed too. They're doing everything they can to wheel and deal with each other. The end has already been determined. They don't know it. So, excuse me. As we look at all of this and the political climate of this region at this time as it's being laid out in Daniel's vision, and remember, this hasn't happened yet to Daniel. This is a futuristic vision. We're looking at it as history. To Daniel, Daniel was writing during the time of the Persian Empire. All of this was a vision given to Daniel, but was not anything he experienced. So if we look at the climate of the time, question 7, on a scale of 1 to 10, 1 being you are amazed at the evil of humanity, and 10 being you are amazed at God's power, where do you fall when you consider the amount of evil that can be in the heart of a man like Antiochus, and yet realize that God fulfilled his purposes through him? How do you, if you had to rate your reaction to this on the good and evil scale, how does it go? How do you assess it? How do you feel about it? Okay. Okay. So one answer is, I'm not amazed at the evil, because it seems to be the consistent trait in human history. Antiochus was a bad dude, and we're going to see just how bad shortly, but he wasn't the only bad dude in history. Not ancient history, not recent history. So we're not amazed at the evil. And the first response here is that there's more of a tendency towards acknowledging God's plan. And I don't know, I got to word this so carefully. It's not that God's plan is for evil to be done to people, but even through the evil that people do to each other, God's plan will prevail. So that's the observation here. Who else? How do you feel about this? Amazed at the evil, amazed at God. Steve? Okay.
Which, at least in my, for myself, pushes me to the spectrum closer to 10. That, yeah, I know how evil man is, but I'm still amazed that at God's power and control he has, in spite of.
In spite of. Okay, good. Yeah, real good observation. The further we go along this historical spectrum, the more time that we have to assess, and obviously we have thousands of years more than Daniel did, or the Jews who were living and enduring the brutality and deception of Antiochus and the Ptolemies, the kings of the north and the south. We have more to assess, thousands of years more, and it just keeps reinforcing the evil. So again, an answer that swings towards 10 on that scale of being amazed that through it all, God's sovereignty prevails and keeps being shown. You know, when we looked at the Gospel of John in a previous study and the book of Revelation, we saw, very overt evil acts. We saw, the work of Satan in undermining Judas Iscariot to stop the salvation plan from being completed, and yet everything that he did, the betrayal that he put into Judas's heart, serve God's purpose. God's purpose, his will, cannot be subverted. Even things that are done actively against it, and we're going to look at a little bit of that here with Antiochus, can only move the world in the direction of God's will. Okay, good. Any other thoughts on question 7? Okay. So we see that he set his sights on Israel. If you think back to chapter 8, verse 9, at that point, the premonition, this vision, the land of Israel was referred to as the beautiful land, depending on your translation. And here we see it as referenced as the Holy Covenant, references to the same people and the same land. So as Antiochus and his army is returning north from their first attack and attempt to conquer Egypt, we see the first attack on the Holy Covenant, the people of God. See it in verse 28. He returns to his own country, but his heart is set against the Holy Covenant. He takes action against it and then returns to his own country. This, Wiersbe tells us, is taking place in the year 170 BC. Excuse me. And again, like I said a couple of weeks ago, the dates, the significance of them is I want you to see the timeline rolling to Christ. That's the relevance of these dates in our biblical perspective. The clock is rolling toward Jesus. So 170 years before Jesus is born, Antiochus is coming through the Holy Land. He attacks Jerusalem. He plunders and defiles it. Okay? How does he do that? Say again? Not yet. Not yet. That comes in round 2. In his first attack on Jerusalem, let's see. Yeah, and in the vision we don't have it. So what he does is as he goes in, he attacks Jerusalem and the land of the Jews. He wages war with them. He wins, and he plunders the temple. He goes in and he takes valuable things. And then he goes on home. He kills a lot of people, and he leaves an occupation army to maintain his influence and authority over this land. And then he goes home, takes his loot, and he goes home. 2 years later, 168, he invades Egypt again. Listen to verses 29 and 30. And listen to how verse 29 starts out. At the appointed time, he will invade the south again. But this time the outcome will be different from what it was before. Ships of the western coastlands will oppose him, and he will lose heart. Then he will turn back and vent his fury against the Holy Covenant. He will return and show favor to those who forsake the Holy Covenant. So he goes back to attack Egypt again. But a third party intervenes. Okay. Third party that is referred to as a naval force. Ships of the western coastlands oppose him. Who is this? Cyprus in Roman hands. From the west, we're now seeing the next progression of transition of empire coming onto the scene. Rome is starting to rise up in the west and is now starting to become powerful enough that they're all the way to the eastern Mediterranean with their fleet. They're seeing what's going on. They're seeing the aggression of Syria, Antiochus IV, Epiphanes, and they step in and they say, no. No. Here we get an idea of the migration of power in this particular region at this particular time, but the way it works in human history. You know, when we looked at the earlier visions in Daniel of the succession of empires, it was kind of a vision that was fairly clear cut. This one's going to be there, then this one, then this one. But we don't see the mechanisms of how it actually happens. And here we get a little bit of an insight. It's not just one empire has fun, you know, clock stops, they go off the court, somebody else comes on the court. This stuff is all happening in transition. So while the four kingdoms that had previously been the Greek Empire are doing their thing and jostling and trying to get more control, and the vision focuses on two, but there were four. Further west, something else is growing, and that is Rome. And now we see them literally coming over the horizon and starting to influence this area. Antiochus was strong. Keep that in mind. This stranger comes in and says, you stop here. And he listens. He was brutal, but he wasn't dumb. He played his cards. And later we see, through the notes and the historical context, the way he dealt with Rome was how? Does anybody know? How did Antiochus IV deal with Rome? Anybody know? Buddy! Welcome to our side of the world. He got in good with them. He finagled so that they tolerated him. They accepted him, loosely backed him, but as long as he didn't stray outside of the parameters they were going to set up. But so Rome is creeping onto the scene as Greece is fading away, and we're seeing that in this 168 as Antiochus makes another attempt to avoid Egypt. Well, he gets stopped, and he gets kicked back, and he's not happy. So now it's not just a passing interest, hey, let's see what kind of trinkets I can get from here. He's mad, and he needs some place to vent it. Before I go on with that, again, just to close a little bit on this migration of power. We see it in antiquity. We're reading about it here in this vision. Bring it more recent. I mean, this was taking place, this vision, over maybe a 300-year period. Start from today and go back 300 years. 300 years ago, 1722, who were the power players in Europe and the Western Hemisphere? Britain alone, France, and Spain. They were the power dogs. They were the power brokers. England and Spain fighting for total supremacy of the seas, powerful navies, influencing all of Europe, this new wilderness of the Americas, down into Africa and the Near East. These are the power players, colonizing and influencing, and with, you know, at the point of their swords and everything. That was 300 years ago. Where are they now? Well, in a union, the European Union, but before that, their power base had faded away. It didn't just stop, it just kind of lost its energy. And as we came into the 19th century, we see the rise of the United States. From nothing, in 1722, we weren't even a country, to by the 1800s, we're quickly starting to rule the world in terms of financial influence, military influence, diplomatic influence, and we rolled like that right into the 20th century, where England, Spain, and France, they're still there, but their influence on the world has tapered down. Resurged a little bit with the unification of Europe, at least the economic unification. You see the European Union, which bolstered the economy of all of the member European nations, but each of them by themselves, their glory days were behind them. And another country rose up. And we can all talk about where we are in our glory days right now. But history says at some point we're going to kind of lose our momentum and someone else is going to rise up. That's the way it works. That's what's going on here. The migration of power. But he vents his frustration on Israel again. But this time it's a little bit different. He's blocked from attacking Egypt, but they allow him to vent on the people and the land of the Holy Covenant, as it's referred to in the vision. But look at the last part of that verse, 30. He will return to the Holy Land and show favor to those who forsake the Holy Covenant. Hugely important verse there. Because what do we see going on as he goes to vent his anger on Israel this time? He's got help. From whom? Traitors of what nation? Israeli Jewish traitors. Collaborators, I kind of think of as a more appropriate term. Excuse me. Because that's something else that is not unfamiliar in history. All right? So as he is twisting the screws to Israel, how are some of the Jewish people responding when we talk about traitors or collaborators? What are they doing? Accepting it, coming into alliance with Antiochus and the Syrian army, but why would they do this? Money. Why else? Favor. Because those that are not aligning with Antiochus, what's happening to them? They're being slaughtered. So we see again that strong vein of self-preservation that runs through human nature, historically. And the phenomena, if you will, of people who become so desperate they will do anything to protect themselves from further harm or exploitation. That's going to come, right? We know that this not only has played out historically, we can look, and I'll give you a couple of examples of more recent history in a moment, but the prophecies of the end time tell us this is going to happen all the way to the end. This desire to collaborate with the powers that be to save yourself, and however that might look. So we see it here. Can you see it? Do you see it at all in the, this is the Old Testament. Do we see it at all in the New Testament? Specifically in the Gospels? Okay, Judas was a collaborator with the Jewish authorities against Jesus. The Pharisees, how, Mark? We see it in the New Testament, which is now the full influence of Rome into this region. They are part of the Roman Empire, again, allowed to be semi-autonomous as long as it's to the convenience of Rome. And the Pharisees, the leading entities of the Jewish community in that day, in the first century, are collaborating, negotiating, although they have no position to negotiate from, to get Rome to allow them to self-govern to some degree. And oh yeah, the ones that were negotiating this are the ones that get to self-govern. So the Pharisees, can you think of another example, Steve?
Tax collectors were famous for working with the Romans against their own people.
Exactly. The Gospels tell us about the tax collectors. Say again? Another one there. And Herod. The tax collectors, as Rome is occupying, one of the ways they keep control over the populace is by taxing them, and taxing them hard. And wisdom on the part of the conquerors, the Romans, and self-preservation on the part of the conquered, the Jews would work for the Romans to collect the taxes. Well, those taxes were exploiting the people. Steve?
One point we didn't mention, but I think comes strongly into play throughout history too, is these people that we're seeing as collaborators, traders, self-preservation, likely lost their faith in God, in God's protection.
Mm-hmm.
New conquerors would come in, and at some point, some of them were saying, God's not going to help us
Because we keep going through this.
because we keep going through this.
Right. So yeah, good observation. The history of this transition of empires that shows up in this vision and goes right up into the time of Jesus with the Roman Empire, if you're the people in the land that keeps getting rolled over, at what point do you just say, apparently God's not going to be a part of this, and you do what you do to survive? Gordy.
I think the clue here is in verse 32. But the people who know their God will firmly resist him.
And we're going to get to that. We're going to get to that.
Know God.
Right. And we're going to get to that. But before we get to that, so you have the tax collectors literally helping Rome exploit their own people so that they live well, because they lived well. Collaborators. Herod is brought up, the puppet king of one of the regions of the Jews under Roman occupation. They set him up as, a king, but a king that answers to them. He did that for his own benefit. Remember the story of the high priests during Jesus' life and the end of life. It talks about two high priests. There were never two high priests. The high priest at the time was one man, Annas, but Rome didn't want him because he was popular with the people. He was chosen by the religious system. They appointed Caiaphas to be the high priest. The people rejected him, but Rome said, no, that's your high priest. The idea of divide and conquer, okay, plays up into more recent history, World War II. What happened when Germany invaded and started to occupy France? You see the French populace split in two. Some become part of the resistance and fight the Germans. But who were the Vichy? Come on in. How can we work this through? We'll work with you. They were collaborators. Italy, same thing. Italy chose to be on Germany's side because of the leader they had at the time. Most of the Italian population was not behind that move. In 2011, I got to go to Italy. I got to visit family, and I got to meet a cousin. In 2011, he was somewhere in his mid-90s. An amazing man. Raised bees, made honey, took us into his apartment. Every space that could hold honey had honey in it. His son had told him, Dad, you got to stop, you're too old. So he said, okay. And with the help of his granddaughter, he kept making his honey and not telling his son. This kind of guy. In World War II, he had fought with the partisans, the Italian equivalent of the resistance in France. And he showed us a picture. I saw a photograph of him, a young man, in a covert radio emplacement in Yugoslavia where they were reporting the German activity for, to the Allies. But it's this idea of when the threat comes in, you either resist it or you collaborate with it. And like was mentioned, after so many years and generations of doing this, it seems that some of these people lost their focus on God or their sense of his sovereignty, which this vision keeps reinforcing at the appointed time. When it was the appointed time, God was in control, but the people would lose sight of that. And then we're going to get shortly to what Gordy just made, but I'm not going to bring it up yet because we're not quite there. You see the same type of thing in prisoner of war settings. I got to go through a prisoner of war school to prepare you for dealing with such things when I was in the service because I was an aviator, and you all had to go through that. And that was an interesting experience that we just aren't interested in doing again. But what they learned from those scenarios are that the people in charge will try to get prisoners to take favors and collaborate against other prisoners. And it divides morale and it does all kinds of bad things. But that's a technique of the victors to break the resistance. So he goes in, let me see. And now he invades on his way back from being frustrated by Rome in Egypt, and he attacks Israel again, the Jewish land. And Wiersbe's very specific. This is December 14th of the year 168. And listen to it in verses 31 and 32. Speaking of Antiochus, his armed forces will rise up to desecrate the temple fortress and will abolish the daily sacrifice. Then they will set up the abomination that causes desolation. With flattery, he will corrupt those who have violated the covenant, but the people who know their God will firmly resist him. The wording is different, and I want you to pay attention to that. The first time he invades and sacks Jerusalem, it says he plunders the city. This time it says he desecrates the city. What is the difference in what happens? Michael, you were going there. Okay, good. Yeah, so plundering is wrecking stuff, stealing stuff. Desecrating is a deeper level of offense and disrespect. Have we seen in the book of Daniel Jerusalem plundered before? By whom? The Babylonian king, Nebuchadnezzar, the opening verses of the book of Daniel. He goes in, and how did he plunder? What did he do? What does it tell us? Good. He robs from the temple. He takes the sacred, the holy vessels as loot and takes them back to Babylon and puts them in his treasure chest. Okay? That was plunder. Have we seen before this a reference to the holy vessels being desecrated? Belshazzar? The last king of Babylon decided to take what Grandpap had stolen and use them for his crazy party, getting drunk, getting crazy out of the vessels of the Lord. And that's when the hand appears on the wall and writes what translates roughly as, "You're done." And that night the Babylonian Empire ends because he desecrated the holy things of God. Nebuchadnezzar did not desecrate them. He stole them, but he didn't desecrate them. And here we see the difference. The first time Antiochus goes in, he steals things, but this time is different. And it's referred to as the abomination that causes desolation, which is a powerful, powerful phrase. What he did is he went into the temple of God and erected an altar to Zeus. That's right, that's right. Jupiter would be the Roman equivalent, but remember, Antiochus comes out of a Greek culture. He erects an altar to the supreme Greek god, Zeus, in the temple of the living God. But he goes further. What does he do on the altar he sets up, Michael? Slaughters the pig to the god Zeus. Now, I don't know. I mean, does anybody here really oppose the smell of bacon? What's the issue? Okay. Let's not get nasty now. Yeah, it's swine, but in the Jewish law, the Jewish religion, and this was the temple of the Jewish faith, pigs are unclean animals in their dietary laws. Going all the way back to Moses, they were not to have anything to do with pigs, not as sacrifice, not as food, not as anything, because God had said, for you, this animal is unclean. What makes it significant in that law that God gave to Moses? Why is it important to know that the pig is unclean? We eat pig, a lot of us kind of like it. Why is it important to understand that for the Jewish people it was forbidden? It sets them apart. Remember what the law was for. Everything in the law that God gave to the people through Moses was to define them as his people, up to and including the building of the temple. Once we got from the tabernacle, the traveling version, to the established version, Laura? Yeah. You're not going to convince me to stop eating ham. No, but you're absolutely right. I mean, there were reasons, and God had reasons, and there's a lot of argument that it was to the dietary needs of the people to sustain them, but the bottom line is it defined them from the rest of humanity as the people of God. So when Antiochus goes into the temple, and we often say the Jewish temple, but remember, it's God's temple by his decree, according to God's law that he gave to the Jews, or rather through the Jews to all humanity. Antiochus goes in there and desecrates it. What is the significance of that? It's not that he had a barbecue where he wasn't supposed to have one. What is the significance?
So he's both disrespecting their God as well as essentially contaminating God's house.
Okay. He's not disrespecting the Jews. He's disrespecting the God of the Jews, the God of the universe. And he's disrespecting the temple and the setup that God gave. So he's violating not the protocol of the Jewish people, he's violating God's presence and authority. That's what makes it the abomination that causes desolation. Now, in talking about those that collaborated with Antiochus, the phrase that's used is that those who violated the covenant. So those that collaborate with him to make their own life a little easier, and maybe as in any other sense of collaboration with an opposing force, there may genuinely be a sense in some people of, if I do this, I will make life easier for everybody, all of my people. Maybe. Why does this refer to those collaborators here as those that violate the covenant? How are they violating the covenant? The Jews who collaborate with Antiochus. Good. Whether they directly participated in it or not, they're accepting what he's doing. It's a beautiful way to put it. They're accepting what he's doing. And you can't accept that action without rejecting God. You can't be in both places at the same time. The covenant is what? When it says they violated the covenant, as it's referred to in this prophecy, this vision, the people of the covenant, the land of the covenant. What is the covenant? Say again? The promise, yes. The relationship. I will be your God, you will be my people. That's the covenant, and they violated that. Steve?
They rejected their servanthood of God for
Very well put. This act of collaboration is an act of rejecting their servanthood to God and replacing it with servanthood to a man. Yeah, very good, very good. Okay. You cannot have two masters. Jesus preached on that. They were trying to have two masters. And you can't do it. You couldn't do it then. You can't do it now. I heard I was listening to some Christian radio today, interesting commentary. I don't know if you've ever heard it. I know it's available on the local channel 99.7 at 1:30, or you can get it as a podcast. It's called The Briefing by Dr. Albert Muller. I strongly recommend you listen to it because his way of articulating the Christian worldview and the premise of what's going on today, I find amazing. I just find it very amazing. So today he was talking about the issues right now, the Roe v. Wade drama that's playing out right now in protests and everything, but other things as well, and school systems and modifications of, I mean, people are trying to modify our language to accommodate certain agendas, and he covers it, and he talks about that. He says, many of the people that are doing this will proclaim to be Christian, they're church folk, but they'll make a distinction, try to, between their personal convictions and their public office. And they try to impose that upon the justices and this, that, and the other. What we're reading here is you can't do that. As it was put, you can't serve two masters. You're either honoring one and opposing the other, or you're honoring this one and opposing the other. You can't serve them both. And that's what we see in the leadership today and in much of the population of our own country is an attempt to serve two masters and make it all okay. But we see from Daniel here, from God's word himself, you can't do it. And that's a lesson we need to take out of this. So as Gordy mentioned, as we get up to verses 33 through 35, the people who know their God. Listen to 33 through 35, the last verses we're looking at tonight. In this contention within Israel, Antiochus and his forces with the Jews, some that are resisting, some that are collaborating, the traitors. These last verses read, those who are wise will instruct many, though for a time they will fall by the sword, or be burned, or captured, or plundered. when they fall, they will receive a little help, and many who are not sincere will join them. Some of the wise will stumble, so that they may be refined, purified, and made spotless until the time of the end, for it will still come at the appointed time. So back it up to verse 32. With flattery, he, Antiochus, will corrupt those who have violated the covenant, but the people who know their God will firmly resist him. We see throughout the scriptures a reference to the remnant in reference to the Jews, all the way through the book of Revelation. The remnant. From Moses leading them out into the desert, there was contention in the masses. Those who were staying steadfastly with God, those that were not. Those that stay with God through history have always been the remnant of the faithful Jewish people who stay faithful to their covenant with God. And it's being referred to here, the people who know their God. A small group, it's always been relatively a small group, who trust God and they fight back. Okay? We contrast them with the traitors, the collaborators who forsook their covenant. These people hold tight. In this historical time, this second occupation of Jerusalem by Antiochus, there was a Jewish revolt. Okay. The Maccabees. All right? There are two books, 1st and 2nd Maccabees, which are historical books, and there's contention within the Christian world as to whether they are inspired books. In Catholic theology, if you have a Catholic Bible, you will find those books as part of your Old Testament, 1st and 2nd books of Maccabees. Protestant theology says they are historical but not inspired. You don't find them in a Protestant Bible. But they are the history of the Jewish revolt against Antiochus at this time that we're reading about, around 168. Okay? The revolt was started by a Jewish priest, Mattathias, and 5 sons of his. They raised an army. One of the sons became known as the hero of this revolution, Judas Maccabeus. I'd always heard that. I always thought Maccabeus was a family name, a last name. It's not. It's a nickname. What does it mean? The hammer. If you remember a couple of generations back in our ambulance chasing lawyer advertisements, we had Jim the Hammer Shapiro. We could have called him Jim Maccabeus if he really wanted to get people's attention. He didn't, but that's what it means. Maccabeus, Maccabee, the hammer. And they fought a revolution against Antiochus IV Epiphanes. And it amazes me that we can go so specific into the history that far back. Wiersbe tells us on December 14th of the year 165, they won. They had victory over Antiochus. The temple was purified. The altar was dedicated. They reclaimed the city, the temple, the faith, and their identity as the people of God. One of the Jewish festivals came out of this revolution. Anybody know what it is? Is it? Hanukkah. Say it again to me.
The oil in the lamp after the victory was only supposed to last 1 day. There's only enough oil to last 1 day, and it lasted 8 days.
Okay. So part of it is that out of this revolution and this victory, there was oil in the lamp that was only expected to last 1 day, but it miraculously lasted 8 days. And this is remembered in Judaism as Hanukkah, or the feast or festival of lights. And it came out of this revolution that is prophesied and is now part of history in Daniel's book. Good. Verse 35 talks about some people, how does it put it? Some of the wise will stumble so that they may be refined and purified and made spotless. Look at question 8. Wiersbe describes the time of Antiochus' evil rule as a refining time for God's people. List some other times throughout history that have refined God's people. You think of any?
Paul, maybe?
Say again?
The Apostle Paul.
The Apostle Paul? How, Louis?
Well, first he was against the Christians, and then when he met up with Christ, he was transformed.
Okay. So in that example, would you think of him as the wise one who stumbled and was refined? Is that would you make that a reference to Paul?
I would say he became wise.
Okay.
Maybe I'm backwards.
The story of Paul's conversion, because we remember Paul was a very educated, wise, and reputable Jewish man who aggressively persecuted this new way, this what became known as the Christian way, until he met Jesus on the road. So was that a stumbling block that refined him? I'd say that would fit. I would say that would fit. Give me another example of when the wise stumble or are stumbled so that they can be refined. And specifically in reference to God's people. Keep it in that context. I don't know. Go ahead. Are we talking the tribulation? Okay. I forget the number, but again, a remnant will survive and receive. Okay. We can see it futuristically in things that have not happened yet, the end times that are, actually we're going to look at next week because Daniel's vision closes with a futuristic look, or the book of Revelation, or some of the teachings of Jesus. Yeah, we're going to see it to the end where there is such hardship. But for those who are the people of God and that remnant who clings to that, they will be refined through that fire of hardship. Yeah, Gordy? Gideon, okay, summarize that.
He was refined definitely by the experience. He had no confidence in himself and kind of doubted God. Had to put out the fleece a couple of times to see what would happen.
Good.
But then he went on to rally a couple of hundred troops and take care of the Philistines
Good.
and set the people back free again for a while.
Good. So during the older Old Testament, the time of the judges before the kings, a young man named Gideon, who was living under the oppression of the Philistines, as all of the Jewish people were, he's trying to, He's trying to harvest his crop, wean his grain in hiding so that it wouldn't get taken from him. God taps him and says, "You're going to lead my army." He's saying, "What?" He definitely stumbled in his faith because he just couldn't get his head around it. Tested God a couple of times. God allowed him to test him, showed him, and yes, he went on to win a victory. So a stumbling to be refined. Good. Okay. All right. Let's go on here to close. I was afraid I wasn't going to have enough material, and no, I'm going to be rushing to finish. Again. Look at question 9. The idea of those who collaborate, who fall away, as we've described. When faced with persecution, as these people were under Antiochus, what are the factors that make people turn back on their faith? When faced with persecution, Gordy? They don't know God. And maybe we need to clarify that and say they don't know him well enough to carry him through the hard times. It's easy to know God and be happy and everything when everything's good. But what about when things are challenging? Gordy?
I think the people that know God know that while they don't want to experience tough times here, it's the next life that's important.
Good, okay.
And that's, Jesus said, don't fear the person who can destroy the body.
And that's all.
And that's all. See, and we have a confidence in God that regardless of what happens here, as long as we stick with him,
Good, good. So to know God more than just casually, to be people of our covenant with God, because there is a new covenant, right? We are also people of a covenant with God. To know him is to have a worldview that trusts him, to have a view that knows that this is not everything. And that as Jesus taught, don't fear the person who can take your life and that's all. Fear God because he controls your eternity. Stay faithful to him and he promises to bring us home. Good, okay. So it's a lack of knowing God. It's a lack of a relationship. It's a casual acknowledgement of God that comes apart when things get rough. And when there's an opportunity to be refined, it doesn't refine you, it consumes you. So there's, Gene.
It's like the parable that Jesus has of the seeds. Their root cast out
Oh,
of
yeah,
the rock.
good. In one of the Gospels, the parable of the seeds and where they fall and how they, whether or not they succeed. Some fall on rocks, some fall on good soil, some fall among the weeds. Yeah, Gordy.
That was really one of the beefs, the main beef, I think, that Jesus had with the Pharisees, was that they were not bringing the people into this relationship with God. They were creating this rules.
Yes.
Do it all this way and enrich us.
Yes. Yeah, that's true. One of the big criticisms Jesus had with the Pharisees, the educated leaders of the faith, was that they weren't doing their job for the people. They were not preparing them for the hard times that would come. And worse than that, they were actually hindering them. He says, you don't go into heaven, and you're blocking the people that want to go in, when it's your job to usher them in. Yeah, okay, good. Yeah. Good. Okay, perspective. Another one of the accounts from the Gospels, Jesus sends out his disciples on ministry weekend to heal and to do things, and they're able to do it, and they're all excited, and they come back, and he says, yeah, that's nice, but that's not the big thing. Marvel that your name's written in the book of life. Good. Okay. Question 10. When faced with persecution, as these Jews suffered under Antiochus, and as Christians will suffer under the Antichrist in the future, what are the factors that make people stand firm, even to their own death?
We know that the Old Testament is a shadow of the New Testament.
Okay.
So everything we just studied, everything we just talked about tonight, showed us from history that every single kingdom and king that rose failed.
Right.
All the kingdoms. So we know
Good observation.
in the New Testament, when they talk in the book of the Revelation, that God wins. I mean, what more do you need to stand on? That's it.
Okay, yeah, that's good. Good observation. We look at the Old Testament as we're looking at the book of Daniel as both prophecy and now from our time in history as history that's already been fulfilled. We should not look at this Old Testament as just a quaint historical romp. Okay, it foreshadows the New Testament. It foreshadows what's coming. It is there not just to tell us what Daniel dealt with or the Jews under Antiochus, but to prepare us, right? So we need to remember that as we move through our lives and whatever generations are left moving towards the end time that is predicted, because one of the things we can learn is that these nations, these empires, these power brokers, nations and individuals, they rise, then they're gone. Okay? Little rocket man can fire all the missiles into the China Sea that he wants. When his time is done, it's done. Because God is in control. There's an appointed time. This vision keeps going back to that. And it's not just something we say, oh, that was pretty cool in that history. No, it's foretelling what's going to always be there until Christ returns to this earth and history stops. So we need to learn. That's good. Yeah, we need to learn. Can I have a moment of silence? Because in the year 163, Antiochus died. He died in Persia. He was generally considered to be insane. And the irony of history, if you will, what was it he called himself? Epiphanes, the glorious one. But he is remembered as Antiochus Epimanes, the madman. An inglorious end to a self-proclaimed God. If we look at the despots, those who rise to power only to use it viciously, we can find a lot of similarities. And we could debate all day long, I guess. Is it an insanity, a mental health issue? Or is it an evil issue? An issue of the head or an issue of the heart? Doesn't matter, but I think it's healthy to consider so that we don't forget that there's another realm here that's working, that we are a part of, even though we don't fathom it yet. We make choices. When death and life are put before you, choose life. We have the opportunity to choose. It's a common theme through the entire Bible. We get to choose life. Okay, good. As you started out saying when we started, as I'm going to finish now, I said that we were going to deal tonight with a pretty bad dude. Antiochus was a nasty man. And as we've already alluded, there's been a lot of people through history that would qualify that way. Why is Antiochus IV Epiphanes specifically remembered as an archetype of the end times Antichrist? Why is he so closely attached to the Antichrist of the end?
Because he did some of the things that the Antichrist will do, because the Antichrist is setting up in the temple.
Okay.
An image to be worshipped.
Okay. Because he does many of the things that the prophecies of the end times tell us the Antichrist will do. Steve?
Well, take even the single event called the Abomination of Desolation. That's exactly what Revelation 16
Okay. Again, what Antiochus did is foretold will happen by the Antichrist at the end time. It's mentioned in the book of Revelations. Jesus speaks of it in two of the Gospels. If you want to read those accounts, it's Matthew chapter 24, verses 15 through 22, and Mark. Okay, hang on one second. Chapter 13, verse 14, and also in Luke. Do you have the reference? Okay, and also you can look in the Gospel of Luke to see it brought up there as well. So specifically, the things that he did that are foretold to the ultimate Antichrist at the end of history is he attempted to exterminate the Jews, but he also attempted to eradicate their religion from the earth. And remember, their religion is the foundational covenant of our relationship with God. So what Antiochus tried to do, what the Antichrist will try to do, ultimately is sever our relationship to God and undermine that. And that's what made him such an archetype of the Antichrist. He's not the only one.
And the enemy thinks that the Jewish religion didn't continue, Jesus Christ would be born.
Okay. It's as we look through the activities of the devil through the Bible, he is apparently convinced that if the Jewish covenant, the Jewish religion, the law, did not or does not proceed through to the end, that somehow this would undermine the return of Christ and the salvation. Thank you. Luke 21 to find the Lord's reference to that abomination that causes desolation. Say again? What? What? Hmm? Ah.
I wouldn't be surprised to see him there.
A man like Hitler, in everything that he is held to in history, in his persecution of God's people, could we see him in history? I guess we'd have to know. I'm sorry, in heaven? I guess we'd have to have been there before he took his last breath. Yeah. Is he looked at as evil and not really at fault? Are we responsible for our choices? We all have the opportunity to choose God or reject God. It would depend on where his heart was before he left this earth, I guess. And it's not for us to know or to judge with him, with any of these active shooters who are committing these atrocities in our communities. Are they influenced by evil? I think there's a strong argument for that. Are they redeemable? Well, they're certainly held accountable, but if they confess and repent, does our God not forgive? We may be amazed at who we play cards with in heaven. All right.
There's an old poem about a highwayman who was riding on his horse trying to escape the law, and he jumps the hedge. I think it's an old British poem.
Okay.
But he jumps the hedge on the horse, and there on the other side is this harvesting equipment with all these tines
Ah.
towards it. And the poem goes, "Twixt the saddle and the ground, his salvation there was found." And what it's saying is it only takes that much time to call out to God.
Sure.
And anyone who calls on him will be saved.
Right. It doesn't take but an instant to sincerely repent and call upon God. You know, the example we have in the gospel is the thief on the cross. We refer to him as a thief, but remember, whatever he did got him capital punishment. Okay? He didn't steal a pack of gum. But he repented. And Christ's words from the cross were, "You will be with me today in paradise." One did, one didn't. And the final thought, this time of the end, remember that through this whole vision, it's always equated with the appointed time. There's no accidents, there's no coincidences, there's no wondering what's going to happen or who's going to make it happen, because it's all in God's time, the appointed time. That's it. Let's pray. Father, thank you for the power of your word, these prophecies, your visions, the understanding you give us through your Holy Spirit, the application to our lives today in our own world, our own country and communities. Father, we submit ourselves to you. We are your people. We are the people of your covenant. We thank you. We praise you. Strengthen us for whatever's coming. In Jesus' name, amen. Good job tonight. Thanks.